Ladies and gentlemen, I am Cadet Second Class Vandermoss, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Malham M. Wakin Character and Leadership Development Award Presentation Ceremony. The United States Air Force Academy's Malham M. Wakin Character and Leadership Development Award is a formal means of recognizing significant acts that are consistent with the Academy's definition of character and our Air Force's core values of integrity, service, and excellence. The award honors Brigadier General Malham M. Wakin, United States Air Force retired, and is presented to the individual or team assigned to the Academy who has made the greatest contributions to cadet character and leadership development by their example as well as their influence. The following areas were considered for the superintendent's overall selection: significant contributions to cadet character development efforts, conspicuous moral courage, great personal sacrifice, conduct above and beyond the requirements of duty, and leadership and professionalism in keeping with the highest ideals of Air Force tradition. Brigadier General Wakin's 50-plus years of developing leaders of character, teaching and mentoring Air Force Academy cadets, faculty, and staff embody the very ideal of character development. It is a great honor that General Wakin and his wife Lynn are able to join us this evening. The Academy would also like to recognize and thank the USAFA class of 1974 for endowing the Wakin Award, thereby ensuring the continued recognition of exemplary character development in leaders at the Academy. Would those representing the class of 1974 please stand and be recognized? Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing the 2018 Wakin Award finalists. Colonel Retired Tom Berry, former Deputy Director of the Center for Character and Leadership Development from the Commandant of Cadets. Mrs. Gina Mensch, Director of Character, Leadership, Culture, and Climate, representing the team of Ms. Gina Mensch and Mr. Timothy Alger, head wrestling coach at the preparatory school, who is unable to be with us tonight. And Dr. Steve Samuels, Professor, Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership, from the Dean of Faculty. Dr. Samuels is unable to be with us tonight. At this time, I ask Lieutenant General Jay Silveria, the United States Air Force Academy's 20th Superintendent, and Brigadier General Wakin to come forward to present this year's Wakin Award Medal. This year's Malham M. Wakin Character Award goes to Colonel Retired Tom Berry from the Commandant of Cadets. Please step up to stage. Colonel Retired Berry demonstrated exceptional character and leadership during his time as Deputy Director of the Center for Character and Leadership Development, and continues to do so in his retirement. He formulated and implemented dozens of policies and programs that are having a positive and lasting impact on character and leadership development at USAFA. Within the Commandant of Cadets mission element, he taught 12 honor lessons and served as a trusted mentor to 182 honor cadets and 4 permanent party members. He advised the honor team during 80 cases, ensuring standards of excellence were upheld. In facilitating character and leadership seminars, he helped 2,000 cadets embrace individualized ethical decision-making frameworks. Colonel Retired Berry contributed to USAFA's mission at the institutional level as he led an integrative teaming effort with the Dean of Faculty, Behavioral Science Department on the new 4th class cadet course, Officership 100. This foundational level character and leadership development course set the tone for collaboration and efficiency across USAFA mission elements. Finally, Colonel Retired Berry's efforts to develop leaders of character extended to our external audience. Of note, he played an important role as ambassador for the Center for Character and Leadership Development to the USAFA graduate community and Board of Visitors, justifying needs for manpower and support in order to equip our future Air Force leaders for success. Furthermore, even in retirement, he is an active USAFA alumnus who introduces cadets to honorable living and provides world-class tours of Polaris Hall, exciting visitors with his enthusiasm and wealth of historical knowledge. In summary, Colonel Retired Barry undeniably lives honorably, lifts others, and elevates performance, the mark of a true leader of character. At this time, General Silveria and General Wakin will present the award to Colonel Retired Barry. The winner's legacy as a Wakin Award recipient will be documented on the wall plaque that hangs in the Center for Character and Leadership Development's lobby in Polaris Hall. Congratulations to all the nominees and to Colonel Retired Barry for your inspiring example and commitment to living the values of integrity, service, and excellence. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to transition to the keynote event of our 25th Annual National Character and Leadership Symposium. Tonight's presentation is supported by the John and Lynn Muse Educational Foundation in the class of 1973. It would not be possible without their financial support. John and Lynn Muse have generously supported this keynote lecture since 2004. Will the members of the class of 73, Mr. Muse and the Muse Educational Foundation, please stand and be recognized. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum is a psychologist, administrator, and educator who has conducted research and written books on the topic of racism. Dr. Tatum uses works from her students' personal experience and psychology learning to educate about racial identity in teenagers and Black assimilation in white neighborhoods. Dr. Tatum served from 2002 to 2015 as the 9th president of Spelman College and is the author of the widely acclaimed book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Other Conversations About Race, in which she argues that Americans are reluctant to talk about issues of race and that we must begin to consider the psychological effects of racial identity development. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Beverly Tatum.
Good evening. I want to begin by thanking General Silveira for extending this invitation to me this evening to speak to all of you and for inviting me to participate in the National Character and Leadership Symposium. Truly, it's been an honor to be here all day, and I want to thank all of you for your participation and for welcoming me so graciously. I have been reflecting on the conference theme, ethics and respect for human dignity. And that has led me to think about what is it that makes people genuinely feel like their human dignity, their humanity has been respected. A psychologist I admire, the late Dr. Jean Baker Miller, once said, "We all want to feel seen, heard, and understood." Seen, heard, and understood. In other words, we want to be recognized as worthy of acknowledgement and listened to as though our life experience mattered. We want to experience empathy. Why does empathy seem so hard to find in a society as deeply divided as ours seems to be at this moment? More than 50 years ago, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a book that points us toward the answer to that question. It's called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, and it was published in 1967. Our society has changed in some important ways since 1967. For one thing, the US population is a lot more diverse. Latinos are the largest population of color, approximately 18%. African Americans represent 13%. Asian Americans are 6% and the fastest growing part of our population. In 1967, only 1% of babies were classified as multiracial. Today, 10% of US babies are. But some things are unchanged. Many of our schools across America are still segregated, and many of our neighborhoods are still segregated. Young people growing up in racially divided communities are almost as separated from each other's daily lives as they were 50 years ago. They arrive at places like the Air Force Academy and other higher ed institutions with little experience connecting across lines of difference. In his book, Where Do We Go From Here?, Dr. King wrote, "Like life, racial understanding is not something that we find, but something that we must create. What we find when we enter these mortal planes is existence, but existence is the raw material out of which all life must be created. A productive and happy life is not something that you find, it is something that you make. And so the ability of racial groups to work together, to understand each other, will not be found ready-made. It must be created by the fact of contact." The Armed Services, of course, has done a great job of bringing diverse communities together, using 4 key principles of social psychology. The first principle, bringing people together as equals. The second, where they are required to work together cooperatively. Third, toward a common goal. Fourth, with the sanction of authority figures. And certainly we see evidence of that across the nation. But there is something else that is needed for us to feel seen, heard, and understood. We have to create contact that allows for genuine empathy. We have to have that contact to create that empathy across lines of difference. And the development of empathy requires listening to each other's stories, each other's life stories. This conference has demonstrated the power of listening, the power of stories. I had the opportunity this morning to listen to 2 sessions. One was the transgender panel, and the other was a speaker, Jessa Chris, who talked about her experience and advocacy against human trafficking. Both presented powerful stories. Listening to those stories creates empathy, but we know some stories are hard to hear. The title of my talk tonight is Listening to Stories That Are Hard to Hear, and I'm gonna start by telling you a hard-to-hear story. This particular story had a powerful effect on me the first time I heard it. It's a modified version of a Chinese folktale about a king who wanted to create a large bell that could be heard across the countryside, one that would be astonishingly beautiful in tone. He commissioned the most highly skilled bell maker he could find, and the bell maker worked diligently to produce a wonderful bell. The first bell he made was good, but not great. The sound quality just wasn't what the king was looking for. A second bell was cast, and still, despite the bell maker's best effort, it wasn't good enough for the king. Finally, in frustration, the bell maker told the king that the only way to get the beautiful tone he was looking for would be to sacrifice a young maiden in the casting of the bell. And so the king ordered his soldiers to find a suitable candidate. In a nearby village, they found a poor woman with a young daughter and snatched her away from her pleading mother. She was sacrificed for the bell, and indeed the bell that resulted was both beautiful to see and had an astonishingly pure and lovely tone. All who heard it marveled at the sound, but the poor mother, who knew firsthand its terrible history, cried with grief each time the bell rang. There was injustice literally baked into that bell, but those who did not know that history never had to think about that injustice. They never had to think about the poor mother's grief. They simply enjoyed its sound. When I first encountered that story, I was a student at Hartford Seminary, and I learned about it in one of my classes. It caused me to think about what metaphorical bells are ringing today. I asked myself, what sound do I enjoy? What bells whose continued ringing is for somebody else a reminder of terrible injustice? Whose story don't I know? Whose sacrifice is invisible to me? What good thing, like the sound of a beautiful bell, am I enjoying at someone else's expense? Certainly my perspective, or yours, about the value of the bell and its sweet sound is certainly going to be shaped by your knowledge or lack of knowledge about its history. Sometimes we prefer not to know such history. If we knew, what would we do? What would be our obligation? Would we stop listening to the bell? Would we condemn the king and try to overthrow his rule? What if the king is long gone? Can we just forget about the price that was paid? Would we demand reparations for the poor mother whose daughter was sacrificed? Or would we shrug our shoulders and say, I didn't order that bell, it's not my fault, it's not my responsibility? How you respond to that question, your perspective, is likely to be rooted in your life experience and may not reflect the life experiences of others. Whose perspective might be missing? Whose history don't you know? These might seem like theoretical questions or even theological questions, but in fact, they have real implications for what is going on around us today. If we extend the metaphor of the beautiful bell to the United States, we must acknowledge that there is injustice baked into our bell. Jim Wallace, a well-known pastor and publisher of Sojourners magazine, writes from his perspective as a white European-American man about this embedded flaw in a book entitled America's Original Sin: Racism, White Privilege, and the Bridge to a New America. In it, he writes the following: "The United States has the most racial diversity of any country in the world. This diversity is essential to our greatness, but it has also given us a history of tension and conflict. Ironically and tragically, American diversity began with acts of violent racial oppression that I am calling," he writes, "America's original sin: the theft of land from indigenous people who were either killed or removed, and the enslavement of millions of Africans who became America's greatest economic resource in building a new nation. The theft of land and the violent exploitation of labor were embedded in America's origins. The injustice was baked in, and a racial hierarchy created that we still see evidence of today. All of that is part of our American bell. And when we hear the bell song or recite its pledge, some, particularly those at the top of the hierarchy, may hear a beautiful sound, while others, particularly those identified with the people at the bottom, feel the pain of past and present injustice. In the last year, we've heard a lot about the controversy sparked by former NFL player Colin Kaepernick's decision not to stand for the national anthem as a silent protest. He was using his sphere of influence, as we know, as a sports figure to remind us of the injustice baked into the bell, injustice that still has not been completely purged, particularly as it relates to our criminal justice system. In the last year, we've also heard a lot of discussion about other symbols and what they represent. We could talk about the differing responses to Confederate flags and statues, for example. Recently, I came across an essay by Tom Ziller, who is a sports writer, who captured two different perspectives, that of Colin Kaepernick and that of another football player, Saints quarterback Drew Brees, who criticized Kaepernick for his silent protest. Ziller wrote the following: "Brees hears the anthem and sees his World War II veteran grandfather and the dozens of soldiers he's met through his involvement with the USO. Kaepernick hears the anthem and sees Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner. These are not mutually exclusive visions. Even World War II provided lessons to this effect. While American soldiers liberated Europe, 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were rounded up and incarcerated by our government. The examples from our slave-owning founding fathers to the century of Jim Crow laws that followed emancipation are endless," he concludes. As Ziller points out, both men's perspectives are valid, but I would argue that the first perspective is based on incomplete information and incomplete history, even of veterans and their World War II experience. White veterans and veterans of color were not treated the same after World War II. The veterans of that war received several major benefits under the GI Bill, providing funding for education, job training, and home loan guarantees, a major factor in the growth of the middle class in America in the 1950s. Yet during the same period, thousands of Black veterans in both the North and the South were denied housing and business loans, as well as admission to whites-only colleges and universities. To give you a sense of the degree of discrimination, of the 67,000 mortgages insured by the GI Bill in New York and Northern New Jersey, less than 100 of them went to support home purchases by veterans of color. When we don't acknowledge this aspect of our history, we fail to acknowledge the pain that was and is still being baked into the bell. And the people at the bottom do not feel seen, heard, or understood. Earlier today, someone asked me about what to do when someone dismisses their experience, when they talk about what we sometimes refer to as microaggressions, and the person to whom they're speaking doesn't seem to want to hear about it. When we fail to listen to the experiences others are having, we leave them feeling invisible, unheard, misunderstood. Similarly, in our nation, people with different life experiences hear different meanings when they hear protesters chant the phrase, "Black Lives Matter," a rallying cry that you know has become associated with the police shootings of unarmed Black men and women. I gave a talk last summer, and an elderly white gentleman told me during the Q&A why he objected to the phrase. He said, "I feel left out, I feel excluded by it." When you hear the phrase, "Black Lives Matter," does it sound like only Black Lives Matter, or does it sound like Black Lives Matter too? To me, it's obvious that the phrase highlights the ways that Black lives have been devalued historically and currently, not just because of what we read about relative to incidents involving police officers, but because the health of Black citizens, both children and adults, can be disregarded when water known to be contaminated with lead was allowed to flow from their faucets for months without taking action, as was the case in Flint, Michigan. And predatory lenders can get away with offering subprime loans to Black and Latino borrowers, even when they have credit scores comparable to white borrowers, who are being offered more conventional, less risky loans, just to name a few examples. Such discriminatory behavior can happen for months, in some cases years, without public outcry, because those lives, it seems, are considered less valuable. But if you don't know those stories, you don't understand what those affected are talking about. And without that knowledge, you can't have empathy. Social scientists know that those at the bottom of any hierarchy usually know more about those at the top than those at the top know about those at the bottom. It's easy to understand why. The maid that cleans her employer's house will know a lot more about the employer's life than the employer is likely to know about hers. She sees the inside of that house and every room in it. But it is entirely possible that the employer has never been to her house or visited her neighborhood and may not know much about the maid's life away from her job. When we don't know the stories of those at the bottom of the hierarchy, our knowledge is incomplete, not just because we don't know the stories of those at the bottom. It's incomplete because if we don't know the stories at the bottom, we can't truly know the stories of those at the top, because those stories are linked. Consider, for example, the story of Georgetown University, a very prestigious college located in Washington, D.C. In a very tangible way, those at the bottom of the hierarchy made it possible for those at the top to be educated at Georgetown. Maybe you read this in the paper. Georgetown, founded in 1789, is the oldest Catholic and Jesuit institution of higher education in the United States. In 1838, facing financial ruin, the priests in charge of Georgetown paid the school's debts by selling 272 of the slaves they owned, netting $115,000, would be $3.3 million in today's terms. A New York Times reporter vividly described what happened in an article she wrote about this history, saying the human cargo was loaded on ships at a bustling wharf in the nation's capital, destined for the plantations of the Deep South. Some slaves pleaded for rosaries as they were rounded up, praying for deliverance. But on this day, in the fall of 1838, no one was spared, not the 2-month-old baby and her mother, not the field hands, not the shoemaker, and not Cornelius Hawkins, who was about 13 years old when he was forced on board. Their panic and desperation would be mostly forgotten for more than a century. But this was no ordinary slave sale. The enslaved African Americans had belonged to the nation's most prominent Jesuit priests, and they were sold, along with scores of others, to help secure the future of the premier Catholic institution of higher learning at the time, known today as Georgetown University. The university itself owes its existence to this history, said Adam Rothman, a historian at Georgetown and a member of a Georgetown University working group that is studying ways for the institution to acknowledge and try to make amends for its tangled roots in slavery, the article concludes. We could call Georgetown another beautiful bell, but the injustice of slavery and the sacrifice of 272 pleading human beings is certainly baked in. How can a bell like that be fixed? How can we fix this American bell we call the United States? Certainly, efforts have been made in my lifetime. I have seen progress. My father was born in 1926, just 3 years before Martin Luther King Jr. was born. My dad was 90 when he died in 2016. He was fortunate to have grown up in a family of educators and was able to attend college in the 1940s, a time that was uncommon for African Americans. He earned his undergraduate degree at Howard University, a historically black college in Washington, D.C., and then a master's degree at the University of Iowa. I should say he was able to do all of that on the GI Bill, and became a college professor, first teaching at Florida A&M in Tallahassee, a historically black college, before moving to Massachusetts in 1958, where he became the first African-American professor at Bridgewater State College, now known as Bridgewater State University. I was born in 1954, the year of Brown versus Board of Education, when my father was still teaching art at Florida A&M. As I mentioned, he earned his master's degree in Iowa, and then he wanted to get his doctorate in art education. Florida State University, which is also in Tallahassee, just across town from Florida A&M, had a graduate program in art education, and it would have been very convenient to attend since it was in the same city where we lived. Unfortunately, because of the segregation of universities in Florida in 1954, my father was not allowed to attend Florida State. But because it was after Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court ruling, the state of Florida was legally required to give my father access to graduate education. The state of Florida met their obligation, not by admitting him to the school across town, but by paying his transportation to Pennsylvania, where he enrolled in the art education program at Penn State and earned his doctorate there. Today, when I tell that story, most people are surprised and shocked because they didn't know that history, and we can certainly see the foolishness of the state of Florida, because instead of trying to keep talented people like my father in the state, their behavior drove them out. Florida's loss was Massachusetts' gain. My dad had a wonderful 30-year teaching career at Bridgewater State, free of many, though perhaps not all, of the constraints of racial discrimination. Today, I can say that when I applied to graduate school back in the 70s, I did not have the limited choices my father did. I was not prohibited by segregationist policies or practices from applying to the schools of my choice. Neither were my children. Yes, in my lifetime, there has been progress. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "The moral arc of the universe bends toward justice." And in my lifetime, I have seen it bend. But lately, it seems that the arc is a little stuck. Progress of any kind is rarely linear. It's often a matter of 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. Excuse me, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, hopefully not 2. Martin Luther King Jr. made a similar observation in 1967. He wrote in his book, "This tendency of the nation to take 1 step forward on the question of racial justice and then to take a step backward is still the pattern. Periods of progressive reform are often met by backlash, as others, perhaps fearful of what is unfamiliar, try to return to an earlier status quo." There are many examples in history of that pattern, and if we are paying attention, we can see that pattern in motion right now. We are at an important historical moment with regard to our nation's legacy of dealing with race. It is a moment that contains both dangers and opportunities. We can allow the forces leading to greater segregation to drive us further apart as a nation, or we can use our leadership as active citizens to make a positive change. As a psychologist, one thing I know for sure is that leadership matters. Fundamentally, we know that human beings are not that different from other social animals. Not unlike wolves, we follow the leader. Yes, we have an innate tendency to think in us and them categories, but we look to the leader to help us know who the us is and who the them is. The leader can define who is in and who is out, and the leader can draw the circle narrowly or widely. When the leader draws the circle in an exclusionary way, with the rhetoric of hostility, the sense of threat among the followers is heightened. When the rhetoric is expansive and inclusionary, the threat is reduced. It sounds simple, but we know it's not. It requires courage, and sometimes it means speaking up against strident voices. But that is what authentic leaders do. And everyone here, regardless of your rank, who you are, or what you do, each of you has the capacity to be such a leader, to influence others, whether they be family members, friends, classmates, or colleagues. The leader has to ask the question, how is the circle being drawn? Who is inside it? Who is outside it? And what can I do to make the circle bigger? We live in a time when anxiety and fear are rising, and us-them lines are being drawn in a way that does not bode well for the health of our society. As Martin Luther King Jr. once said, we are caught in a web of mutuality, and that means we have to know the stories at the bottom as well as the stories at the top. We need a much wider perspective, seeking out the stories, the histories we don't know. Each of us, everyone here, has the opportunity to broaden our perspective by listening to people whose lives experiences are different from our own. And certainly a learning environment like this one is a good place to start. Before I became a college president, I taught a course on the psychology of racism for more than 20 years. And as my students learned more about the enduring nature of racism as part of their course reading, they often felt overwhelmed and helpless to do anything. They used to say, you know, the problem seems so big, what can I do to make a difference? And I used to say to them the same thing I will say to all of you. You have more power than you think. Everyone has a sphere of influence. Family members, friends, classmates, coworkers, colleagues in your book club, members of your house of worship. When you think about it, your social network is broad. Use it. We are all part of a chain of change agents, men and women, white and of color, who in large and small ways have taken action. People who asked difficult questions at the meeting, risked some discomfort, used their social power and privilege to interrupt the status quo, regardless of its source. We must not break that chain of courage and commitment if we want to see continued progress, if we want to fix our bell. While I was working on the new edition of my book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, I traveled to Texas. I was invited to speak on the campus of Texas A&M, and something happened there that gave me some hope. By coincidence, the week before I arrived, there had been a racial incident. A group of Black teenagers from a high school in Houston were touring the campus. During the tour, they were approached by a small group of students who yelled racial slurs at them. What's hopeful about that, you might be asking, and I will tell you nothing. But what gave me hope is what happened next. The student body president, a young white man named Joseph Benino, who graduated in the class of 2016, issued a statement on YouTube, just 3.5 minutes long, but it was clear, concise, and courageous. Acknowledging that he himself had been silent in the face of racist and sexist remarks that he had often heard behind closed doors, he recognized that his and others' silence gave permission for the hateful remarks to be made publicly. He said, "Our silence fosters hate. Our silence enables the hateful to feel comfortable and welcome." He urged his fellow students to take responsibility for making a change. I was very impressed with his statement, and if you're interested, you can watch it yourself on YouTube. Just type in the statement of the Texas A&M student body president, and you'll find it. His example of leadership was, for me, a sign of hope. It's clear that empathy requires effort. Listening to other people's hard-to-hear stories is not easy. As Dr. King said, racial understanding is not something that we find, but something that we must create. Are we creating it? We could be. In 1967, Dr. King ended his book, Where Do We Go From Here, with these words. He wrote, "We still have a choice today, nonviolent coexistence or violent co-annihilation. But," he warned, "this may well be mankind's last chance to choose between chaos and community." If we don't want chaos, we must choose community. We must choose to draw the circle widely. We must choose to see, hear, and understand. We must choose to listen, even to the stories that are hard to hear. And then when we have listened to those stories, we need to let them inspire us to work for lasting change so that we can all enjoy the sound of beautiful bells, bells harmonized with the tuning fork of social justice as a united community together. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dr. Tatum, on behalf of our 2018 NCLS participants, the cadet wing, and the faculty and staff of the Air Force Academy, please accept this gift as a token of our appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you.
We once again extend our thanks to the USAFA Endowment, the Association of Graduates, the Class of '73, and all others who through their generosity make NCLS possible. Finally, a special thanks to the John and Lynn Muse Educational Foundation for sponsoring this event. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes this year's John and Lynn Muse Keynote Lecture and Wakin Award ceremony. Please join us for a light refreshment reception with Dr. Tatum and other NCLS speakers in the McComas Lounge, which is located outside the auditorium and down the hall. Cadets, you are dismissed.